Welcome back, folks, to episode 100 of the Running Man Self-Regulation Skills Project podcast with me, your host, Dr. Armando Dominguez, PhD in health psychology, licensed professional counselor, and an adjunct professor at a local community college. And what we're going to discuss today is going to be hinging upon episode 99, where we're talking about the F's of survival. And what we're going to be specifically focusing on is procrastination and the battle of will that occurs there and how it's actually reflective of the F's of survival, states of being that keep us from doing the things that we know we want to do, things we need to do, things we got to do, but somehow put them off or delay as far as tasks go. And what can we do about it? Self-regulation skills to the rescue. Some really important things to note about procrastination is that, generally speaking, in the common speak, procrastination is considered a negative, and it's not always so. Sometimes procrastination, if we redefine it a little bit by adding the term hesitation, hesitancy isn't such a bad thing. It's actually reflective of survival capacity where we need more information. We have to gather more data. Now, I'm keeping this out of the time loop at this point because if we start adding the idea of time, how quick things are happening right now, and the need within an immediate sense versus one that is unraveling or unfolding that and it's not necessarily a survival orientation where I could get hurt or killed, this sort of thing, as a result of hesitation, then that adds another layer of intensity, but also understanding as to what we mean by procrastination and hesitancy that we'll wrestle with a little further down the pipes in this discussion. But for now, just the definition itself of hesitancy and hesitation as it ties to doing a task, just our day-to-day stuff in our regular social mind where we're running around with our mask of the policy on, the mask of the marketplace. I love that term. But at the same time, there is a certain connotation and state that we run around with when we're interacting and when we're doing transactional relationship that's called our day-to-day, how you doing, how are you, this sort of thing, paying money and getting our goods, this sort of thing. And we have to keep in mind that that is our day-to-day doings without any complications for the most part. Any is absolute in a sense, but in the sense of nothing dangerous, nothing that requires turning 90 degrees and going left or right and exiting quickly because something happened, but rather just in the general flow of things. When we are actually interacting with folks, it is very much above the social survival line that is never spoken about and is definitely not a concrete thing, but is one that we kind of live within. And that paradigm, that level of consciousness is a state that has to do with judgment, self-judgment, and higher cognition and our prefrontal cortex, all those things that we label and organize and categorize and make sense of in our world. And therefore, things fit in little neat boxes and categories that allow us to be more efficient in our lives, wasting less energy, and more effective. That means we get the output or the outcomes that we're seeking, our goals being met, so to speak. And procrastination speaks rather deeply to that part as far as the outcomes and the goals. Now, the importance of those goals, of course, they can vary depending on person or what's going on. But the importance of what procrastination really is not necessarily a social thing. It is not necessarily something that has to do with your value as an individual. Because let's play a game, a little mental exercise. Let's say we have a very important task, and let's say we have to get this task done within a work day, or I have to go and, let's say, water the animals before I go into town. But if I don't do those things, there's definitely going to be either one, a lack of outcome that is favorable. The animals could get dehydrated. If it's too hot outside, they could suffer. Or if this task isn't done, I could possibly lose pay, job, or opportunity, this sort of thing. Or I could get judged by my peers in a negative sense. And they all bring certain connotations of negativity if we look at it within that lens. So what is procrastination once again? Well, there's a hesitation to do a task, but also in that waiting period that occurs within procrastination or hesitation or hesitancy in particular, whenever I'm waiting and there's this sense of I need to go forward, but there's an ambiguity about it. There's an I don't know quality. There's an unknown. Unknowns bring up fear by themselves, but here's the thing. If we have an ambiguity, that means I don't know enough. I don't have enough data, and then fear creeps in, and we start having the self-judgment of doing things correctly, doing it right. Am I doing this wrong? Oh, why don't I know enough? Or I didn't prepare enough. I was not aware of. Or we start having all these adjudications that can often, if we're doing this within our own mind, judging ourselves, we're judging ourselves negatively, maybe a little heavily. And if we are our own, let's say, harshest judge in our lives, then that can be rather impactful, especially if we've had let's say, an upbringing or a childhood where that was really frequent or common. And therefore, when they're no longer there, we've learned to judge ourselves that harshly because that was their guiding attempt, or more so a goad, like a goat herder would have to push with a stick, the goats along the path, so to speak. And we were goaded sometimes. And once again, we assume those judgment methods, and the procrastination may come because we don't want to hear or feel those things even in our own mind. So often procrastination can come from no external preparation. It can also come from an internal sense of ambiguity. I don't understand, or I don't have enough data. And the hesitation within that, not doing the task for a moment, could be an attempt to gather more data and this is if we don't jump into that immediate sense of self-judgment and judging the whole situation as somehow an extension of my own failure or lack as far as an individual, or maybe lessening of my value in the process of trying to do something that I should have been, in quotes, prepared for. And I say should have because that is a heavy adjudication, to feel like someone should have something or should have done something. And that means that we've been saddled with an accountability and responsibility as a result of being involved with said task. So this is an important thing. Now, what does this have to do with self-regulation? Well, at this point in the conversation, it doesn't have anything to do with self-regulation, but more so a self-flogging and self-judgmental quality. But what can we do to prevent that self-adjudication before it goes too far is really the question we're asking here. One of the things is recognizing that whenever we do hesitate and procrastinate, these are reflections of a survival drive. We talked about the F's of survival. It started with the 4 F's in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then this has been expanded upon as of recently, wherever we've studied, even within those primary drives of survival, the fight, flight, flee, freeze, and fornicate, and also feed. That's actually 5. But then we realize that even within those behaviors, there are certain nuances and subtleties that are reflective of survival orientation. I will speak of one. Whenever we fail and we're around an authority, often we will, one, get upset, maybe feel shame and guilt, but also we may have a sense of wanting to placate and seeking the authority for their help. And this is called fawning. And that placation quality is not friend and befriend in the sense of let's be buddies and let's go have dinner later, but rather it's more so showing one's belly and showing a submissive quality, which means that you could hurt me and I'm letting you know you could hurt me, but I don't know what I'm doing whenever we do that. But we generally don't want to do that as adults. We don't want to do that as children because there are those that are more dominant and predatory in quality amongst us that aren't necessarily disordered in personality, but are happy to take advantage of that power differential and maybe bully you or leverage you and do things that maybe otherwise you wouldn't do of your own accord. Now, what we're hinging upon here is how I interact with myself within my own mind whenever I am in that state of either stress or needing to do something and I don't have enough information, resulting in, once again, that hesitation that hopefully gives us time to gather more data and complete a task. And hesitation and procrastination and delay aren't always terminal things, but we tend to look at them this way. What I'm trying to do is steer away from that terminal view, but rather understanding that we have to kind of look at that sense of terminality and that level of seriousness whenever we do procrastinate, because that's really what we're talking about. When we hesitate doing a task that really is not a life endangering or in anything along the lines of survival drive triggering event, then we're looking at something that's considered day-to-day, small potato, so to speak, but one that does not necessarily trigger a high level of stress. And those are the little details And the little picadillos, if you will, that whenever I don't do like pick up my laundry or I'll leave my socks on the floor, they may elevate someone's stress a little bit, but I can walk away and it's going to be okay. No one's going to die as a result. And we may even weigh it that way in our own mind just to make sense of it and not to expend energy in that direction, because I'd much rather spend energy in the direction of I'm going to walk to the bed and go take a nap. And that's okay. We just have to put them in an appropriate space. And the reason I'm delineating this is because there are some people that do struggle with even taking smallish day-to-day tasks like that and not avoiding doing them. And they elevate their own stress because now we have obsessions and compulsions that without these things being done, levels of anxiety get terribly high, and I start to have dysfunction, and I start to dysregulate emotionally and get very hyper reactive to things wherever things are maybe a little bitty. Maybe a glass fell off the table and made a mess. It didn't break, but there was a mess and I have to clean it up. And we overly respond to it. We overly react. We become hyper vigilant about things and fearing things going wrong, when in actuality, there's nothing that is threatening the individual, but yet the body responds as if it's under real life endangering stress. So that's why we're trying to stay away from the terminal definition right now of what procrastination is and the negative connotations, but realizing that there's a reflection of survival drive that kind of colors or flavors the type of procrastination that we have, if you will. And we have to keep in mind that, we have different states of responding to threat, so to speak. Now, whenever we have, for instance, hesitation, often hesitation can work to your benefit. The late Dr. Glenn Morris wrote a book called Path Notes of an American Ninja Master, probably the premier, most favorite book of all time for me. But he writes of a certain incident where hesitation actually saved the life of an individual. And this individual was part of a parade going across a bridge in South Africa, I believe, and I don't know if it was like an Olympic team or something like this, or Olympic athletes, but elite athletes no less. They were going to trips across this bridge, and apparently they didn't do what the military does and the break march, wherever break step is, to create discordant versus those things that are harmonious vibrations, and the bridge collapsed. But he was at the step, about to step onto the bridge, but he stepped back, whereas everyone stepped forward and they fell with the bridge, the ones that were his peers next to him. But he fell backwards towards the ground, and he wound up having to help out, fish the people out of the river that survived, and there were a number that did die in that incident. But his hesitation was a very gut-felt reaction. We're going to touch the gut feeling thing. I know that there is one CIA operative, former CIA operative, talks about don't trust your gut. And I will tell you, to the degree that he speaks, he's largely accurate when you're dealing with things that are higher cognitive process. But when it comes to hesitation and avoidance, trust your gut. It's a very old knowing. Our enteric brain is there for a reason. And we respond to things that often don't make cognitive sense. They don't make social sense in that, I'm going to offend them. But yet there is something that is not okay. And you have to honor the fact that your most basic self, your most basic organism, protects you at all times. That's why sometimes we have excessive anxiety, excessive worry, because your body's telling you there is something wrong. Now, when it comes to procrastination, is it always what's wrong on the outside in our external environment from the skin out versus the skin in? And no, there's not always something that is visibly wrong that we can tell, but there can be something that reminds us to be safe because we're not sure what the deal is, or something that's similar. And that can get a little hairy, especially if it generalizes to our everyday life. Now, the important thing here is that whenever we do trust our gut, often there is an aversion to a space or a distance required. Not only are we seeking information, but we're backing off. This is reflective of what happens to our body, in that often whenever we're running very fast, heart rate goes up, we go into foveal vision. That means we focus very clearly, 3D in depth, forward. We start losing our peripheral vision. That means I don't need the peripheral vision as much because I don't need to perceive motion as well. So therefore I have more like looking at out the end of a coffee can vision, which is our tunnel vision that people speak of at the worst whenever they remember traumatic events. But also when people run, you see very clearly to the front. You can't see behind your shoulders anymore without turning your head in an extreme sense. Besides, if you're trying to outrun something, you just need to look at where you're going. You don't need to look and see who's following. You just need to know that if they're following them, you need to outrun them. That's the important part. And the important part of the vision aspect that we're talking about is a recognition of whenever we procrastinate, often when we're looking at a goal or an outcome or a place we need to get to, we need to see clearly in that direction, to the detriment of all the extraneous information that's coming in from our peripherals. And not unlike that, we have to focus on what it is that we need. And when we have that sense of tunnel vision or focus, that allows us that. But the problem is if we move into that direction of stress, our eyes and our vision, physical vision, starts moving that direction. Our consciousness tends to reflect what our physical body is doing, often narrowing and becoming very hyper-focused and very absolute and black and white, up and down, and consistently binary, consistently what we would call dualistic. It's either good or bad, up and down. Good or bad for me as an individual is what we have to identify, because I'm the I that is being protected here. And that is an important thing to recognize as far as state of mind, as well as state of body being reflective, therefore, the F's of survival, so to speak. So what is it that I'm speaking about having to do with procrastination and hesitancy? Physical hesitation sometimes requires a step back, like the gentleman that did not step onto the bridge when it collapsed. Our body requires more space when we become very foveal focused or centrally visual focused, because I can't see to my periphery as well. That means I need to scoot back to get a wider view, because my eyes aren't naturally in that wide view or that wide lens perspective as whenever I'm more relaxed and I can take things in with less effort. And on top of that, whenever we have that sense of I have to step back to gather more information, there's also that sense of overwhelming, because we become technically a little dumber, because if the blood flow leaves the front part of our brain, our higher cognition starts to fail, because I don't have the fuel with the requisite glucose to do the thinking process that I need to reason, categorize, and label and define, so I know what to do it with, where to do it, and when to, these sorts of things that are higher cognitive processes. We tend to be more avoidant and possibly more reactive if things are very, very fast moving in the direction of us. If they're looming, the definition in the biological sense is we have a ball or a sphere out in our distance that we're looking at, and it's the size of a ping pong ball, but all of a sudden that sphere, we'll call it a black sphere, and it turns into this really huge sphere moving at us that is not only coming in our direction, but growing in size. That means we probably need to get out of the way, and that thing is either pursuing us or chasing us. When anything gets larger in our view, that very quickly, then we go into avoidance and into our fight-flight programming, so to speak. But when we procrastinate, often those things that we see looming, now the time part comes in our immediate sense of future, when things get bigger or seem closer, and therefore we have consequences that seem closer and more final. That's when we start having experiences of fear and judgments of self for failure. And these are states of mind that occur as a result of how quickly these things come on. And these states of mind come on very fast. Emotions come on very fast. And sometimes that really negative self-adjudication comes on equally as quickly and makes it even more uncomfortable. And then, of course, once the event is over, whether we succeeded or failed at it or didn't complete it or had to run away or we froze or had to ask for help for whatever reason, then we have to deal with the aftermath. What's left? Sometimes it's that negative self-judgment. Man, I couldn't deal with this on my own. I needed help. We start feeling like somehow we're supposed to be this island of absolute and total control and reactionary measure that is legendary and capable of overcoming every obstacle. And fact of the matter is that that's really kind of unrealistic and unfair to yourself, if anything. But also, whenever we hold others in that sense, we also create procrastination in our peers, not only by what we say and what we speak, but what we may be reflecting out or projecting more correctly. What is it that we're showing? And if we think about mirror neurons and realize that much of what we model, people will model and mirror as well. And we are providing a social suggestion that's very powerful. One that, even though you're not speaking it in words, but rather by your state and by your behaviors, by your actions, you may be creating a pre-programmed state of reactivity in things around you in the social milieu. I will give you for instance. These are things that are very well studied, but whenever you look up hypnosis, for instance, and suggestion, that you can actually kind of seed what somebody's going to be saying and speaking by just saying certain things or doing certain things. And when you do that, you may drop a suggestion or a word, and then later people will come back around and talk to you, and they'll be using the same word that you were speaking, especially if it's an unusual thing. Then you realize that that is within their conscious mind, and there has been a suggestion or a seed suggestion laid in their mind that maybe they're not picking up and they're not even aware of, for that matter. They just take it as common everyday speak. But you see that often enough, you realize that often we are not only, I don't want to call it pre-programmed, but we are encouraged to remember things that may or may not have a weight or a value that could have to do something with survival or successful interaction with somebody. And it's a very subtle thing. And it's not necessarily a higher conscious, I'm choosing to do this, but rather it's something that stays in our short-term memory. And it may just be a matter of friend and befriend. It may be a mere neuronal reaction. They don't have a perfect idea as to why it occurs, but they have theories as to why it's socially valuable. And being able to remember those things means if I look like you look like me, we're wearing the same jersey, somehow at some level we're on the same team. And it's not placating necessarily, but rather it's a friend and befriend reaction, and it's not a nefarious thing the way some of these hypnotist folks like to talk about it. But it can actually influence, by the way, what it is that occurs in our environment, in our immediacy, also later on down the line, especially if it's repeated frequently. So we've touched upon procrastination, but trying to get a broader sense as to where it extends from. And it's not a failure. If you're trying to do business, people talk about procrastination as if it's an evil thing. And when it comes to executing and getting things done, can it get in the way? Absolutely. But when it comes to human interaction, daily interaction, and regulating the stressors in self, we have to realize that not all procrastination is a bad thing. It is a survival reaction, and it is a reflection of the F's of survival, so to speak, those survival drives that are very deeply driven. And we have to know that sometimes whenever something suddenly occurs and we are procrastinating, the battle of wills occurs. I say wills as in plural. My higher cognitive social mind, the prefrontal cortical processing that categorizes names and labels and makes sense of our world moment to moment, that is what we call our social will, so to speak. But we also have our will to survive, our survival drive. And they treat it almost like in the literature, like it's a unconscious thing. Some of it is preconscious, to be more correct. But it also is something that we become aware of once we're in it. And there are those that add descriptions that sound like personalities, and we'd call them more subpersonalities. Our survival drives, whenever they're on, if we were to meet below the level of survival, rather in the level of survival below the level of social norm or the marketplace, the mask of the marketplace not there, how would we treat each other? Some would realize, wow, that's kind of ugly. Or, man, I would do that only in these conditions. But if we were walking around literally unmasked in our lowest level of social survival self, survival's ugly. There's nothing pretty about it. And it's also bloody, stinky, covered with urine sometimes whenever we eliminate to fight, flee, and run. And nobody wants to talk about this. But fact of the matter is we're never so far from it. And it's always a wise thing to be able to regulate how much stress we have. And also, in our best attempt, try to be prepared so you don't put yourself in an unnecessarily stressful event, because we're always very close to that. And we don't want to run around dealing with each other in the survival level, because it is very, I don't want to say antisocial, but it's definitely not pro-social. But it becomes asocial in the sense that it doesn't play by the rules. It doesn't necessarily work best within the guidelines of the social mind. And if we recognize that and love it anyway, realize that's part of us that keeps us alive, even when we get a little stressed or anxious, then we recognize the gift that we have every day to be able to overcome things if we need to in a more physical sense. And when we feel capable of doing that, we get much more able to be forgiving of ourselves and other people and realize that we all struggle sometimes. Not all life is a struggle, but life has struggle in it, and we have it sometimes too. So one of the kindest things you can do is be kind and patient with yourself and realize that whenever people aren't being particularly kind, that there's a level of stress they're expressing because something's not okay. And it's okay to have a little room to say, you know what, I get it. I've experienced things like that, or maybe not nearly as extreme, but having some compassion, a little empathy goes a long way. Just don't fall too far into sympathy where it gets in your way and then you start to procrastinate. Not a cool thing. But that's really the end of the discussion for today. In episode 100, woohoo! That is my excited. I'm celebrating. We made it to the century mark with this podcast. And I know that was a little week, but that's okay. I didn't want to yell and wake up my neighbors, but I do want to tell you thank you for your listenership up until now, and please bring more people along. If you know people that could use this podcast, please share it with them. It's available on all platforms that you can find your podcasts on, from iTunes to Amazon Music and also Spotify, as well as iHeartRadio and a number of others. But my channel is also on YouTube. On YouTube, I have a few videos of old lectures that I did back during COVID time for students whenever I was teaching some bio survival stuff. But also I want to tell you that if you have any feedback or questions or something you'd like to hear me do some discussion on this podcast, please send it to the email at runningmangetskillsproject@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. But on top of that, take it easy, because you know what? Life can be long. It can be short, but it can definitely be threatening and stressful sometimes. But be ultimately kind to yourself and those that you love. Hey, squeeze them, because we never know. We may not have as much time as we think. And I certainly appreciate your walking with me. Take care. Walk well.